everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library. Thank you all for coming today for our book talk. Copies of our book are on sale at the front of the room. Professor Klarman will be on hand to sign books after his presentation, so I'd encourage you to do that. This talk is being recorded today, so during the presentation and during the Q&A session, we will be recorded, and it will be broadcast on the law school's YouTube channel sometime next week. Our guest today is Professor Klarman. He is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor here at Harvard Law. He is a renowned legal historian. He teaches and writes in the areas of constitutional law and constitutional history. He has written books exploring racial and sex equality in the constitutional context, winning the Bancroft Prize in History for his first book, From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, the Supreme Court and the Struggle for Racial Equality. Today, Professor Klarman will be sharing from his very recently published book, I think it came out 3 days ago, The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution. So without further ado, Professor Klarman. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. So usually I would start with some sort of reference to the Red Sox, but it's actually too painful a subject. Plus, I don't have that much time, and I want to give you all time for questions, so I'm just going to jump right into it. I'm going to talk to you about this book that was just formally released a couple days ago. The book, as I see it, makes 3 contributions. So it's called The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution. 3 main contributions. So a disturbingly large number of you have actually already heard me talk about this, so I'm not sure why you're here, but in any event, okay. I wish I had something different to say about it, but I'm not sure I do. Okay, so 3 contributions. First of all, there are some really marvelous books written about pieces of the story. Dick's heard me talk about this. I don't know why Dick's here. Right, okay, I'm getting distracted, right. So there are many wonderful books written about pieces of the story. Nobody's actually written a book within 2 covers that covers the whole account of the U.S. Constitution. So starting with the flaws in the Articles of Confederation, working through the state economic and monetary fiscal policy disputes of the 1780s, then the Philadelphia Convention, then the battle between Federalists and Anti-Federalists over ratification of the Constitution, then the Bill of Rights, which was added a couple years after, as I'm sure most of you know. So I thought there was a certain virtue in filling that gap in the scholarship, even though, as I've said, there's a rich and voluminous literature on pieces of the story. I think this is the first book on the making of the Constitution from soup to nuts. Second of all, I've tried to tell the story as much as I possibly can through the words of the participants. So there's this vast literature, primary literature, and one of the advantages of being at Harvard Law School is I have access to terrific research assistants and a fabulous librarian who's designated as my reference librarian. And there are all these incredible documentary histories. So, for example, the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution is now 27 volumes, and it's not done yet. And each volume has like 500 pages of diaries, letters, people who are trading in government securities, writing letters back to their home base in Scotland, talking about whether the securities are going up or down based on whether the Constitution is likely to be ratified or not. All that stuff is available with a click of your computer. You can sit there in your living room and you can access all this stuff. So I've tried to tell the story as much as I can through the voices of participants. I think that has the virtue of maybe making the story a little bit more vibrant. And it also has the advantage of allowing people to form their own judgment, so you can decide if my interpretation seems persuasive. And then third and finally, I've tried to give a sharper edge to an interpretation that's been out there for a long time. I don't claim any originality in inventing this interpretation. I agree with the interpretation, but I've tried to explore a little bit more as to why it may be true. So that interpretation is the Constitution as a kind of conservative counter-revolution against the forces that were set in motion or accelerated by the Revolutionary War. Okay, so those are the 3 contributions I've tried to make. I thought I'd talk now about 3 points that are made in the book, and that'll take me about 25 more minutes, and then I'll stop and ask for questions. So point number 1, I'm going to describe for you ways in which the Constitution was more nationalist, and by nationalist I simply mean shifting power from the state and local level to the national level. So the ways in which the Constitution was more nationalist and more constraining of democracy. Sometimes I'll talk about anti-populist. Sometimes I'll say democracy constraining. I mean those basically as synonyms. Okay, so that's the first part of the talk, just describing the ways in which the Constitution is more nationalist, more democracy constraining than probably most Americans expected the Philadelphia Convention would accomplish, and maybe more than most Americans actually wanted the Philadelphia Convention to push the country in that direction. Second point, I want to try to explain how the framers wrote that Constitution. Why were they unrepresentative of the country at large? And then third, and I think most interestingly, how in the world did they get the country in a fairly democratic process, and we have to add the obvious conditions, democratic for the time, democratic for the era. They didn't allow women to vote. They didn't allow black people to vote. They didn't allow people without property to vote. That doesn't sound very democratic from our perspective, but from the world's perspective, in 1787, the United States had the most inclusive democracy of anyone. So how in the world did they get a fairly democratic ratifying process to approve a constitution, one of which's principal accomplishments was constraining popular influence on government? Okay, so that's a roadmap of where I'm going now. So I'll start with the point of describing the nationalizing features of the Constitution. First, Congress gets almost unlimited taxing power under the Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no taxing power. All it could do was requisition, i.e. request, that states provide money, which states would or would not do as they deemed attractive under the circumstances. Often states just didn't pay their requisitions. Under the Articles, there had been a proposal for an amendment. That amendment would have given Congress the authority to impose one sort of tax, import duties. That was rejected. They never got any amendments to the Articles approved. The Constitution goes from no taxing power whatsoever to almost unlimited taxing authority. Second, Constitution gives Congress virtually unlimited military authorities. Congress can raise an army, Congress can raise a navy, Congress can call up state militias into federal service. You need to compare that with the Articles of Confederation. All Congress could do under the Articles was requisition troops. Again, ask for troops, but not necessarily the case that any state would cough them up. Now, there were proposals made at the convention, and there were criticisms of the Constitution made by anti-federalists that said Congress should only be able to raise armies during wartime, or there should be a limited number of troops that Congress could raise, or that you should have to have supermajority requirements in Congress if they were going to raise an army during peacetime. None of that was adopted. Philadelphia Convention gives Congress essentially unlimited authority to raise armies, navies, and call state militias into federal service. Third, Constitution gives Congress unlimited power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. There was no such power like that of any sort under the Articles. Fourth, Congress has implied powers under the Constitution in the form of the Necessary and Proper Clause. Necessary and Proper Clause says that in addition to the enumerated powers of Congress, Congress can adopt measures that are necessary and proper for implementing the enumerated powers. That's in contrast to the Articles, which explicitly limited Congress to explicitly delegated powers. Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation said Congress only has those powers that are expressly delegated. Fifth, Constitution supplies a mechanism for enforcing federal supremacy. Under the Articles, there were no way, for example, to make a treaty which Congress had adopted effective against state governments that wanted to ignore the treaty. Under the Constitution, Madison, who was the most important person at the Philadelphia Convention, and I'll explain that a little bit later, Madison actually wanted the national government to have the power to veto any state legislation. Nobody had ever made a proposal like that under the Articles of Confederation. That was a completely novel idea, and even the Nationalist Convention thought that was too nationalist for their taste. So instead, they adopted a tripartite system for enforcing federal supremacy. First, the Supremacy Clause clearly spells out that federal law is supreme over state law. Second, the Constitution authorizes federal judges. It actually mandates that there be a U.S. Supreme Court, and it authorizes Congress to create lower federal courts. Contrast that with the Articles of Confederation, where there were no general jurisdiction federal courts. And then the final part of that scheme, Article 1, Section 10, forbids the states from emitting paper currency or interfering with the obligation of contract. That's a measure that was designed to suppress state debtor relief legislation, which a majority of states had adopted in the 1780s. Now, you have to keep this in mind. A majority of states had quite recently adopted paper money laws and debtor relief laws to assist farmers who were going bankrupt in a Great Recession that followed the Revolutionary War. The Constitution forbids that. It creates federal courts and federal supremacy to ensure that the federal government will suppress such legislation at the state level. That was unanimously adopted by the Philadelphia Convention, even though a majority of states within as little as 1 or 2 years had adopted such measures. That alone tells you there's something unrepresentative about the Philadelphia Convention. Okay, so turning from the nationalist features to the anti-populist features, and the feature I just mentioned is both. Article 1, Section 10 both constrains populist democracy at the state level and gives the federal government the authority to ensure that those sorts of debtor relief laws no longer get passed. So, anti-populist features. First, long terms in office. Under state constitutions, the lower house of legislatures, those legislators almost invariably had 1 year time in office, except in a couple of New England states where they actually served only for 6 months. Under the Articles of Confederation, delegates were appointed by state legislatures for annual terms. Under the Constitution, you get 2 years for the House. They actually provisionally agreed on 3 years and changed that toward the end, probably because they want to maximize their chances of getting the Constitution ratified. Presidents serve 4 years. That's longer than any governor in the nation served at that time. And senators serve 6 years, which was longer than any legislator or governor served at that time. Most of the delegates wanted to go further. As I said, they actually had agreed on 3-year terms for representatives. Many of them favored 11 years, 13 years for senators. 4 delegations in Philadelphia, not delegates, 4 delegations actually approved of lifetime tenure for presidents. Alexander Hamilton wanted lifetime tenure both for senators and presidents. He thought that was the only way you could adequately protect property rights, which would inevitably be insecure if you had a democratically accountable government. Second feature, indirect elections. The only office holders in the federal government who were directly elected were House members. Senators were selected by state legislatures. That persisted up until the 17th Amendment, which wasn't adopted until 1913. Presidents were and still are today elected by delegates in the Electoral College who are, who might be elected by the people, but might very well be appointed by state legislatures. That's what many of the founders had in mind. They didn't trust the people to play a direct role in electing federal office holders. As indicative, as illustrative of that distrust, George Mason, an important delegate from Virginia at the Philadelphia Convention, said that asking the people to choose the president directly would be like referring a trial of colors to a blind man. Right? Think about running for office on that platform. That's going to be real popular with voters. The framers even tried to limit the House in various ways to make it less populist. So the House is the only institution at the federal level where you have a direct election. The House also only has 2-year terms that members serve. But they actually adopted a variety of mechanisms to try to make the House even less populist than would appear at first glance. So they created a very small House. The original House of Representatives is 65 people to govern the entire country. Compare that to, for example, the lower house of the Massachusetts legislature, which back then had over 350 members. So the idea was if you have a very small house, you have very large geographic constituencies, and they believed that large geographic constituencies would favor the election of the sort of people they liked in 2 different ways. One is they figured in large constituencies only famous people, large landholders, military heroes would get elected. And they also believed that the larger the constituency, the looser the connection between a representative and that representative's constituents, which would enable the representatives, in Madison's words, to refine and enlarge, i.e. ignore, their constituents' sentiments. Okay, so that's the small House. They also believed, and this is not widely known today, under Article 1, Section 4, Congress has the authority to revise state regulations of the time, place, and manner of congressional elections. Now, what does that mean? They thought that Congress could tell the states that they would have to elect their congressmen at large. So what does that mean? For example, Virginia was going to have 10 representatives in the first House. under this theory that the framers were trying to designate, although the Constitution is suitably vague for this purpose, Congress would have the authority to say to Virginia, all 10 of your representatives get elected by all of Virginia, rather than in districted constituencies. That would be a gigantic constituency which would enable the election of, quote unquote, the better sort of people, the large landholders, and it would disconnect representatives from tight binding relationships with their constituents. Finally, the Constitution omits instruction, recall, and mandatory rotation in office. I'll explain those in 1 second. Many state constitutions had those features. Under the Articles of Confederation, congressmen were bound by those features. The Constitution rejects that, and this is an omission, so therefore is less likely to attract attention. Instruction means what it sounds like, which is you tell your representatives how to vote, and they have to do it or else resign. Mandatory rotation means you only serve a certain period of time, and then you're rotated out of office. And recall means that your constituents or the legislature who's ever appointing you can recall you during your term in office. So under the Articles of Confederation, you had annual terms in office, but you were subject to recall at any time. Constitution omits all of those features, thereby making representatives even freer of influence from their constituents. Okay, the purpose of these democracy-constraining features was very clear. They wanted to make sure that the federal government would never be subject to the influence of the populist impulses that had passed tax and debt relief legislation in the 1780s, and they hoped that the federal government would suppress such measures under Article 1, Section 10. All right, so that's the first part of my talk. Second part, how did the Philadelphia Convention manage to accomplish these things? One leading contemporary critic of the Constitution, called them anti-federalists, which is what they were called at the time, said that, quote, the democratic and aristocratic parts of the community were disproportionately represented in Philadelphia. That's an accurate statement, and the question is why. Here are several discrete points that together might constitute an explanation, and I admit this is fairly speculative. I said a few minutes ago that I was trying to provide a sharper edge to a conventional interpretation that's out there. This is part of the sharper edge. I'm trying to explain why the Philadelphia Convention was representative, and then I'm trying to explain how they managed to get such an unrepresentative document ratified. Okay, so first, state legislatures in every state but South Carolina were the institutions responsible for choosing delegates to the convention. In South Carolina, the governor chose the delegates. Everywhere else, it was legislatures. The legislature seems simply to have chosen the most famous citizens of the community, which would mean at that time they're likely to be military veterans. Remember, this is right after the Revolutionary War. Most political leaders were Revolutionary War veterans. And it also means people who were likely to have served in the national government, in the Confederation Congress. Now, it turns out both of those are profoundly nationalizing means of service. If you fought in the Revolutionary War, in the Revolutionary Army, you fought to build a nation, and often leaders like George Washington, the general, the commander-in-chief, regarded the states as being as obstructionist in the Revolutionary War as the British Redcoats, and Washington became a strong nationalist as a result of constantly having to battle the states for money and men. So if you served in the Confederation Congress, you're used to thinking about the interests of the nation rather than the interests of your state. You served in the Revolutionary Army, you're used to thinking in national terms. In addition, the most eminent citizens were generally wealthy and well-educated, and those characteristics correlate with people who are skeptical about populist influence on government. So simply by virtue of trying to pick their best-known, most illustrious citizens, there was probably a bias in the pool toward nationalism and anti-populism. Second, opponents had no reason to mobilize their forces in opposition to the nationalizing and democracy-constraining project because they had no way of knowing what was going to happen in Philadelphia. It turns out that the agenda of the convention mostly existed in James Madison's head. That's not for any particularly good reason. Madison wasn't the most illustrious person, not by far. Franklin, Washington were at the Philadelphia Convention. Madison was known outside his state, but he was not one of the leading statesmen in the country. He was the only one who bothered to sit down, think through systematically what are the problems with the articles, what are the problems with the state constitutions, and map out an agenda, a structure of government for trying to solve those problems. He then encouraged his fellow Virginians to show up early in Philadelphia. They coordinated with the Pennsylvania Convention, all of whom came from Philadelphia, so they were already there. And they came up with a proposal known as the Virginia Plan, because it was introduced by the Virginia delegation, which became the working blueprint for the Philadelphia Convention. And it turns out where you start influences where you end up. And even though Madison lost on several issues that he cared deeply about, the fact that the Virginia Plan proved the starting point for the convention's deliberation had a lot to do with how the Constitution that they finally came up with on September 17th looked. And the Virginia Plan was extremely nationalist and anti-populist. Third, and this seems almost like a fortuity, some delegates who had been appointed by their legislatures, for example, Patrick Henry in Virginia, Richard Henry Lee in Virginia, Samuel Chase in Maryland, all these people would become leading anti-federalists, that is, critics of the Constitution. They were all appointed by their legislatures, and they all decided not to go to Philadelphia. Now, it's dangerous to generalize. I'm speculating here. Some of them offered reasons, but we don't really have any good way of knowing why they didn't show up. But one possibility, it seems to me, is maybe they weren't interested in what they thought would be the mildly nationalizing agenda that you would have predicted for the Philadelphia Convention, and they had no idea that there was a radical reform enterprise in the works. If they had suspected it, maybe they would have shown up to fight against it. They certainly fought against it once the Constitution was proposed and was up for ratification. Fourth, some delegates who did go to Philadelphia and who opposed the nationalizing and democracy constraining agenda made the dubious choice to leave early when they thought the convention was trending against them. So that's John Lansing of New York, Robert Yates of New York, Luther Martin of Maryland. They left early mainly because they were losing in Philadelphia, and they didn't want to legitimize an enterprise that they saw as deeply illegitimate because they thought the Philadelphia Convention had been constrained by instructions from Congress, yet it ripped up those instructions basically on day one. Now, it's always a dubious choice. You see this happening all the time in the world today when a country's holding elections and the opposition says they're illegitimate. Do you decide to participate, thereby legitimizing the enterprise but trying to defeat it? Or do you opt out, thereby delegitimizing it, but enhancing the chances that the final product is going to be something that you like even less? Fifth, the delegates in Philadelphia made the critical decision to close the doors of the old Pennsylvania State House, which is where they were meeting. They had good reasons for doing so. Madison later explained, and I think he's right about this, that if they hadn't closed the doors, they probably wouldn't have gotten any Constitution at all. But one effect of closing the doors was it liberated the delegates to take extreme nationalizing and anti-democratic positions that they would have feared would jeopardize their careers if they were willing to embrace them in the open. In addition, maybe even more importantly, by shutting the convention's doors, they made it harder for their opponents to begin mobilizing. Basically, they got a 4-month head start, which they wouldn't have gotten if the press were in the galleries and could report on what was going on. And then sixth and lastly, the delegates made the momentous choice that they were going to go for broke. Washington and Madison had exchanged correspondence before the convention, and each of them was egging on the other, saying, we don't believe in temporizing expedients. We ought to propose the form of government that we think is the best form of government the United States could have. When Edmund Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia, introduced the Virginia Plan at the beginning of the convention, this is what Madison's notes record him as saying, quote, he, that's Randolph, would not, as far as depended on him, leave anything that seemed unnecessary undone. The present moment is favorable and is probably the last that will offer. In sum, what they were doing was they were saying, this is our last chance, let's go for broke, let's get the best government we can get, let's not temporize, let's not adopt narrow reform measures, let's revolutionize the structure of government and hope we can get the country to approve it. Okay, so the last question is, how in the world did they get the country to approve this thing? that was so dramatically different from what most people probably expected and probably wanted. The first point to note is we shouldn't think it was inevitable that they won. It's worth emphasizing how close the battle was and how narrowly the Federalists triumphed. So initially, Rhode Island and North Carolina rejected the Constitution, and the New Hampshire Convention would have rejected the Constitution most likely, but the Federalists shrewdly adjourned it. They'd gotten there early so that they could play a role in adopting the procedural rules. They managed to adjourn it when they probably would have lost a vote. In addition, in several of the largest states, the vote in favor was so close that it's easy to imagine that the Federalists could have lost. So in Virginia, the final vote was 89 to 79. In New York, it was 30 to 27. In Massachusetts, it was 187 to 168. Those are very narrow margins. It's easy to imagine the vote coming out the other way in those states. Those are 3 of the 5 largest states. If 1 or 2 of them had rejected the Constitution, there's a good chance that it would have been impossible to form a union. All right, so Federalists had a number of advantages in the contest. It was not entirely a fair fight. You might even say the system was rigged. Federalists, first of all, they benefited from malapportionment. This was especially an issue in South Carolina, although it was an issue in other states like New York as well. So the South Carolina legislature was badly malapportioned. Population moved from east to west, but people in power are rarely altruistic about distributing it away from themselves, so the legislature never reapportioned. The coastal planters, who were the richest men in the country, had huge slave holdings. They were the ones who controlled the legislature, and they were the ones who controlled the convention, and they were strongly in favor of the Constitution. Those people who lived along the coastal area of South Carolina were about 20% of the white population, and they elected 60% of the delegates to the convention in Charleston. So right there, it's likely the case, I think most historians agree, that if you'd had a referendum in South Carolina, there would have been majority opposition, but instead the convention ratified by a 2-to-1 margin, demonstrating how malapportioned it was. Second, the press, call them the media, overwhelmingly favored ratification. The media was clearly biased on this question. Almost all newspapers were published in cities, even though only about 10% of the population lived in cities at the time. That meant that subscribers and advertisers played a disproportionate role. They were overwhelmingly supportive of the Constitution. Anti-Federalists in many states had a hard time even getting their essays published in the newspapers. In the words of one of them, Agnes Burke, who was a leading Anti-Federalist in South Carolina, quote, "The whole weight and influence of the press was on the side of the Constitution." There are about 90 newspapers in the country in 1787. Only 12 of them, 12 out of 90, published any significant amount of anti-Federalist literature. Third advantage of the Federalists, several conventions were held in coastal cities, Charleston, South Carolina, Philadelphia, Boston. In those cities, support for the Constitution was almost universal, and that was true across class lines. This would have an effect both inside and outside of the state ratifying conventions. All of the conventions were open to the public, unlike the Philadelphia Convention, and spectators would attend sitting in the galleries, and they were not shy about making their opinions heard. In Connecticut, for example, where Federalists dominated the galleries, they would whistle, hoot, and stomp their feet while anti-Federalists were trying to make themselves heard. And in South Carolina, where the delegates would adjourn in the evening to open houses that were held by members of the Eastern planter elite, you can be sure that they heard nothing but positive things about the Constitution being whispered into their ears. Fourth Federalist advantage was simply the way in which support and opposition was distributed geographically. The Federalists benefited from overwhelming support in cities, such as they were. This is a country of about 3.8 million people at the time of the 1790 census. The largest city in the country was Philadelphia, population of which was somewhere between 30 and 40,000. So there are no cities like London, for example, which had 1 million people at the time. But such as they were, cities overwhelmingly supported the Constitution, and so did people living along the seaboard. This is an era of primitive transportation and communication. It's much easier to organize people in cities and people who live along the coast. Most anti-federalists came from western regions or from backwoods regions closer to the coast. Very difficult, bad roads, no real transportation other than horses, very difficult to communicate. Therefore, the anti-federalists, even if they had roughly the same number of supporters as the federalists, simply had a harder time organizing their forces. Fifth, the better sort of people, and both the better sort and their opponents referred to these people as the better sort. The people who were well-educated and well-born meant it as a compliment. The other side used it sort of sarcastically, as if you think you're better sort just because you're well-born, but they didn't really necessarily acknowledge them as the better sort. But this better sort, as they were called, overwhelmingly supported ratification everywhere but in Virginia. In Virginia, the elite was actually divided pretty much down the middle, but not elsewhere. And that meant a significant oratorical advantage for Federalists in ratifying conventions to the extent that delegates came with open minds. And that's not true everywhere. In some of the conventions, they didn't have open minds, but in others, they did. To the extent delegates had open minds, backwoods farmers could not possibly compete with these well-educated elite Federalists who could quote Cicero in the original Latin. They were often intimidated out of trying to speak before their better-born and better-educated opponents. So, for example, at the Massachusetts ratifying convention, one leading anti-federalist, Amos Singletary, complained of, quote, "these lawyers and men of learning and moneyed men that talk so finely and gloss over matters so smoothly to make us poor illiterate people swallow down the pill." Right? He's being sarcastic. He doesn't really think of the anti-federalists as poor illiterate people, but you understand the extent of the anti-elitism there. These people are trying to sell us a bill of goods, these elite lawyers, preachers, doctors, the well-educated elite. Final advantage for the Federalists, which they created for themselves, Article 7 of the Constitution. Article 7 provides that once 9 states have ratified the Constitution goes into effect. Now, those 9 states can only bind themselves. No state can be bound without its consent. Nonetheless, that's a significant shift from the Articles of Confederation, where unanimous state agreement was necessary for any amendment to the Articles. Now, the Federalists simply made this up. Nobody going into the convention would have thought that you could change that rule, that every state had to consent to whatever was coming out of the convention. Federalists simply took a shot and hoped people would be willing to accept it, and they did. Now, why does this matter? Think about how you've shifted the bargaining power from the Articles to the Constitution for prospective holdout states. Under the Articles of Confederation, a prospective holdout state could try to bargain for better terms. So 12 states actually ratified the amendment that provided for Congress having the authority to raise import duties. New York was the lone holdout, and in the spring of 1786, New York actually went to Congress and said, we'll ratify this on the following conditions, one of which is New York wanted to be able to substitute its paper money for the gold and silver that it raised as tariff duties. Right? You can imagine the difficulty this puts Congress in. Compare that with prospective holdouts under the Constitution. Once the new nation was up and running, if you didn't ratify, because you were one of the 4 last states to do so, you would not be protected by the federal military. Your trade might be subject to discriminatory tariffs, and you would have no voice in the first Congress, which was going to be deciding critically important issues like where are you going to put the national capital, and are you going to amend the Constitution to include a Bill of Rights. All right, so I'm almost done now. The Federalists also benefited from some anti-Federalist miscalculations, especially in New York and Virginia, where the anti-Federalists had agreed and perhaps even had proposed that the ratifying conventions be held late in the process. So the New York ratifying convention and the Virginia ratifying convention didn't meet until June of 1788, even though the Constitution went out to the country 9 months earlier in September of 1787. They probably calculated, the anti-federalists in Virginia and New York, probably calculated that it would benefit them to give them more time to organize their supporters, and they might have believed that their states would exercise more influence if they decided later in the process. But it turned out by doing so, they made themselves largely irrelevant to the outcome, because by the time the Virginia Convention met, 8 states had ratified, and the New Hampshire Convention was about to reconvene, and the predictions were almost universal that it would become the 9th state to ratify. And by the time New York ratified, 11 states, New Hampshire and Virginia included, had already approved the Constitution. New York actually had an anti-federalist majority of more than 2-to-1 at the ratifying convention, but New York still ratified because once 10 states had already put the Constitution into operation, they felt like they had no choice. Okay, the last important point to note, the Federalists managed, I think this is important, this is something that I learned as I was working on the process, so I think this is speculative, but I think this point is right. The Federalists managed to keep intermediate options off the table, and that was a critical component of their success. So intermediate options would have been a constitution that was somewhere in between the obviously flawed Articles of Confederation and the vastly more nationalist, anti-populist Constitution. That's probably what most Americans would have wanted, and the Federalists desperately tried to prevent giving them that option. So the two main ways to have gotten that option on the table would have been either through antecedent amendments, meaning amendments that were ratification conditioned upon amendments, as opposed to ratification with a promise that there would be amendments down the road, or a second convention. Now, the Anti-Federalists made pretty good arguments in favor of both of these procedural devices. The argument for antecedent amendments was you would have to be a lunatic, to quote Patrick Henry, who was the leader of the opposition in Virginia, you would have to be a lunatic to approve a form of government on a promise that there are going to be changes coming down the road, but nobody will tell you what those changes are. Wouldn't you insist before you undertake a contract to know what the terms are? The Anti-Federalist argument for a second convention was we just had a first convention that operated in the dark and that did something that nobody predicted. Now we've had a national debate. People have expressed their concerns. Let's gather all that information, look at all the amendments that have been proposed by the state ratifying conventions, and now we'll elect new delegates who will go to a second convention and write a different constitution that's closer to what most people want. The Federalists made both legal and practical arguments as to why neither of those procedural devices was possible, but I think the real reason was they knew they could never duplicate what the Philadelphia Convention had proposed. The cat was out of the bag. People knew now what was on the agenda, and there was a good chance that they weren't going to support it if they were given the opportunity to achieve something closer to what you might call the median voter would have approved. So, for example, consider Randolph proposing the following to Madison before the convention. In correspondence, Madison and Randolph, the governor of Virginia, are talking about what the convention would do. And Randolph says, whatever we propose, let's do it in a form that the people can agree to the provisions they like and disapprove the provisions they don't like. Madison was horrified by that idea, and he ridiculed the notion that the American public were informed enough to have opinions on issues as important as governance. Here's what he told Jefferson later in 1787, quote, "In Virginia, where the mass of people have been so accustomed to be guided by their rulers on all new and intricate questions, the matter of whether to ratify the Constitution certainly surpasses the judgment of the greater part of them." Okay, so to sum up, the Constitution almost surely was more nationalist and more democracy constraining than most Americans expected or would have wished for. The framers took advantage of surprise to get it drafted. Then they barely got the country to approve it. They benefited from some advantageous circumstances. They benefited from some good luck, some of which they created for themselves. And they benefited from some miscalculations by their adversaries. Whether you agree or disagree with what they did, whether you think it's legitimate or illegitimate, I think you have to admire their skill at pulling off what I think can only be called a coup against public opinion. So I left some time for questions. Sandy.
Yeah, not surprisingly, I look forward to reading the book, and I'm sure I'll agree with basically everything you say. But I'm intrigued by literally your last sentence. Are you presenting this book only as an historian, full of very, very interesting details and arguments about 1787, 1788, or do you think it has any implications for the way in 2016 we should teach or regard the Constitution as a foundational document?
So people can draw their own conclusions. I do talk at the end of the book. I resisted the inclination, which I think a lot of people were pushing me to do, is to talk more about originalism and what sort of light does the book shed on how we ought to interpret the Constitution today. I've never thought originalism was a very sensible way to interpret the Constitution. And when you look at a lot of what went on in the Philadelphia Convention and the ratifying contest, I think there are additional reasons for why originalism doesn't make a lot of sense. And those involve some things I haven't talked about at all today, like the extent to which people were just pursuing their narrow interests. They weren't really dispassionately reflecting on political philosophy. But the state of New York was trying to protect its advantages because it has the best natural harbor, and therefore it could impose import duties that were forcing surrounding states like Connecticut and New Jersey to finance the New York government because half of those states' consumption comes through New York Harbor, or how Virginians in the West are calculating, if we adopt the Constitution, we think the national government is going to sell off our right to use the Mississippi River. But on the other hand, if we don't ratify the Constitution, we're worried that we're going to be murdered by Native American tribes that are starting to start a war against Georgia. Right? They're making calculations that are all the sort of narrow calculations that people make in politics. And it seems weird that 225 years later, a document that was written under those circumstances and the ratifying contest that was fought over in those sort of ordinary political ways would make a lot of sense for governing ourselves today, in addition to the fact that they were elitist and they were racist and they didn't believe women should participate. I mean, it just seems weird that people held such different values and were confronting such different issues would have written a document that makes a lot of sense to interpret as it was originally written. But that wasn't my point in writing the book. The other obvious connection today, which I alluded to not too vaguely, is what do you think about populism? The Tea Party, obviously, they have the history exactly backwards. They should love the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists are the ones who are the Tea Partiers. They don't believe in national power. They believe in direct democratic control. When I worked on this book, up until the last year, I didn't like that aspect of the framers. I think that the debtor farmers had really good arguments for pursuing the loose fiscal and monetary policies that they did. You had a severe economic recession. These people were being wiped out. State governments were raising higher taxes, forcing that you pay in gold and silver when there was essentially no gold or silver to be had. They were losing their farms, which were being sold off, but they couldn't get fair market value. And the money was going to pay off the war debt, which was increasingly combined in the hands of a few wealthy speculators. Literally, when the debt was funded under Hamilton, you're talking about 200 or 300 people holding 2/3 of the state and federal war debt, which most of them had bought up at a fraction of par value. They'd often bought it from these very farmers and soldiers who are now being asked to pay higher taxes to pay off the debt which speculators had bought from them. There's a really good argument in that context for loose fiscal and monetary policy, but the elite thought these were a bunch of communist-inclined farmers trying to redistribute property, and Shays' Rebellion was an effort to take over the state and redistribute wealth, and that's not what it was. So I'm actually pretty sympathetic to them, and the Constitution was an effort to suppress that sort of direct democracy. In the last year, as Donald Trump inches closer and closer to the presidency, populism doesn't look so good. And the framers seem pretty wise, because what they said was democracy will lead to a demagogue. That's why we don't trust democracy. Most people are too clueless about government. They're too distracted. They're too ignorant. They're not really going to pay much attention. And you're going to get some smooth-talking demagogue who's going to convince them that he will deliver the world. And, they thought it was Patrick Henry, but, they would have identified Donald Trump if they'd had the chance. People laugh, but I'm actually serious about that. I mean, if a democracy means 40 or 45% of the country votes for somebody who would be the most dangerous president you could imagine in our lifetimes, then I'm not sure, democracy doesn't necessarily seem like such a good idea if it leads to that. Now, of course, you can't say that or defend that as a political position today, right? I mean, if Hillary Clinton says these are a basket full of deplorables, that you can't do that as a politician, even though many of the people who will vote for Trump obviously are deplorable. But you don't call voters names, right? Not in a populist political system. I'm sorry. That's a talk next Friday. Yeah. Whether American democracy can survive President Trump. Yeah.
I hope you don't give that talk. But I have a two-part.
I was asked to give it, Dick. The students wanted it.
I hope that it's not after the election that you're giving the
It's
talk.
before the election.
So I have a two-part question. The title of the book, The Framers' Coup, makes it sound vaguely in the genre of great man history, that a few people made this happen. And so I wonder if you just comment on that. That's the first part of the question, whether there's something peculiar about this time or whether that's generally so. The second part of the question is it's a era in U.S. history in which we all think we know something about the leading players. And now that you focus so closely on the leading players, who are the ones who are underrated and who are the ones who are overrated in terms of pulling this off?
I like that. I like that a lot. So the short answer, a little facetious but accurate, is the marketing people take control of the title. So I was going to call it something else, but I actually like the title. It's not like they foisted it on me. I was going to call it a paraphrase of a Benjamin Franklin quote, which was something like passions, prejudices, errors, and interests, the making of the U.S. Constitution. Franklin was saying that these are great men, these are the greatest men in the country, they're extraordinary people, but like everybody else, they have their own passions, prejudices, errors, and interests. I think he said that on the last day of the convention. I like that, but they said there are too many nouns in that title. The marketing people want something else. I had said to them, I was thinking of writing a law review article called "The Constitution as a Coup Against Public Opinion," and they love that. So I'm fine with the title. The great men, I do think it was possible for a relative handful to make policy back then in a way that wouldn't be true today. But I don't want to suggest it's just Madison and Hamilton. They're stand-ins for lots of other people, lots of well-connected, prosperous, important local leading figures in the banking community, lawyers, prosperous merchants. So, I could name some names, but I'm not sure these are sort of second-tier people that you wouldn't have heard of today. But people like Jeremiah Wadsworth of Connecticut, Henry Knox is an important player. He probably rises to the top tier. There are lots of those people in Virginia, people who are Madison's correspondents. So, but we're talking about hundreds of people. We're not talking about thousands of people. Yeah, I think in a way that just isn't true today, where you have, look at how populist you are. You make law in California through initiative and referendum. Donald Trump wins millions and millions of votes to become the Republican Party nominee. Compare that to the Virginia legislature picking its most eminent citizens. Washington, Henry, Mason, Lee, Madison, they just picked their most famous, illustrious citizens, and they're the ones who went to the convention, and they're the ones who wrote the Constitution, and they're the ones who tried to sell it. Now, at the state ratifying convention, you're talking about maybe 1,500 delegates at state ratifying conventions, and they're voted for by maybe several 100,000 voters. So that's what you're talking about back then. Underrated and overrated. So I love the question. Madison is extraordinary. Madison played a critical role in all of this. The calling of the convention itself, he was one of the 3 or 4 leading figures. The Virginia ratifying convention, contemporaries all observed Patrick Henry is the greatest orator of the age. He's the leading opponent. Madison is doing yeoman service in response to him. So Madison, probably without his efforts, Virginia wouldn't have ratified. Virginia was by far the largest and most important state. Without Madison's influence, George Washington might have refused to attend the convention, and Washington provided enormous legitimizing force for the Constitution. And then without Madison, there clearly would not have been a Bill of Rights. That's all him. So you read his correspondence, just extraordinary. Same thing with Hamilton. Off the charts, brilliant, taught himself public finance, spending his spare time reading Adam Smith and writing letters to Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, saying, I was reading Adam Smith, and he said this, and I think New York could provide this amount of taxes. Just off the charts, brilliant, while they're doing a million other things with their lives. Washington is a unique figure. He is more influential and more revered by anyone at any time in the country's history, I think. Maybe Eisenhower after he wins World War II. Washington is unique. He's going to provide extraordinary legitimizing influence for the Constitution. Everyone assumes he'll be the first president. That provides reassurance for people who are worried that the president might become a monarch. Washington is important for selecting wise men around him. Madison's his principal advisor. He writes his inaugural address. He chooses Jefferson and Hamilton for his cabinet. But if you read Washington's correspondence, he is not a distinguished political thinker in the same way those others are. And when he's deciding to go to the Philadelphia Convention, there's this wonderful correspondence between his former aides, Henry Knox, and David Humphreys in Washington. And when you look at Washington's calculations about whether I should go to Philadelphia, they're mostly focused on whether he's trying to preserve his reputation, and he's very risk averse. He's not necessarily thinking, how can I serve my country? Is this important thing to do? But more like, I have this pristine reputation. I'm the Cincinnatus who laid down, his generalship to take up the plow, and am I going to be risking people thinking I'm grasping for power, and is it going to be successful? If it's unsuccessful, of course, I'll be chosen the president of the convention, so I'm the one who'll get most of the blame. And it's not a very attractive picture, right? I'm thinking about, should I risk my reputation for the good of my country rather than this is a really important thing to do, I should lend my service to the cause. So I wouldn't say I'm not impressed with Washington, but I'm a law professor. I like people who think in analytical ways. And Madison and Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson, those guys are unbelievably sharp and impressive. And you think about all the other things they had going on in their lives, right? I mean, they didn't, well, I'll leave it at that.
Hi, I've only skimmed some of the things in the index about Gordon Wood, but I was interested to see that you had approved of some of his beliefs about the social implications for the founders. But I remember one of the claims he made was that the Shays Rebellion didn't actually contribute a lot to the convention because he said the timing was off. But I saw that in your book you did think that Shays Rebellion was a large part, so I was wondering if you had addressed that part of his argument.
Gordon Wood said that?
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. So I'm drawing on Gordon Wood's interpretation in general. So I give Wood tremendous credit for the conservative counter-revolution interpretation. If he says that about Shays Rebellion, and I've read so many different accounts, I don't remember who says what, I think he's pretty clearly mistaken. So, one difference is, Gordon Wood is, he's one of my favorite historians. What he did 45 years ago in the creation of the American Republic is extraordinary. But remember, none of the documentary histories existed back then. So when Gordon Wood did his research, he's literally traveling around by car to dozens of different archives, whereas all this stuff now is combined in one place. Shays Rebellion was incredibly important to the convention. Now, obviously the convention was started before Shays Rebellion. They have this Annapolis Convention, which is meeting to try to adopt commercial reform. That's in September 1786, right when Shays Rebellion is starting, and before it becomes a really serious affair. And Shays Rebellion is then suppressed finally in February of 1787. A bunch of states had already signed on to the convention, but it seems quite possible that Massachusetts wouldn't have gone, that New York wouldn't have gone, that Connecticut wouldn't have gone, and that Washington wouldn't have gone had it not been for Shays Rebellion. So there's a lot of direct evidence, and the timing there does fit. So New York and Massachusetts haven't decided to attend until February, which is right after the apex of Shays Rebellion, when the first people are actually killed in a battle between the militia that was put together to suppress the rebellion and the farmers who were leading the rebellion. So I don't even think Wood would disagree with that anymore. It's not that Shays Rebellion is the only thing that matters, but Shays Rebellion is turning the New England elite against democracy. 2 years earlier, the New England elite wanted to strengthen Congress to regulate commerce, but they were not interested in making the national government anti-populist. And by early 1787, Madison and others are saying, can you believe these New Englanders? They're willing to support a monarchy now. Right? There's direct evidence making that point about how dramatically the New England elite shifted their view in the anti-populist direction. All right, so yeah, one more.
I'm just curious because you talked about how the anti-federalist elements were sort of isolated or being manipulated somehow. I wonder if you can make a counterfactual assessment of if the whole thing was taking place in a media environment more similar to today, with all the social media and all the radically democratic media environment. How would it turn out?
Yeah. So there's no way to know. And when I call it a coup against public opinion, I always have to qualify it. We don't have Gallup polls. They didn't do referenda. We don't know for sure. Most historians seem to be pretty comfortable with the idea that the country was close to split down the middle. So if you imagine not only the media the modern media, but also a modern mechanism like a referendum. If the country had just had one national referendum and you had a media culture where everybody could read a copy of the Constitution, although the problem is it would be easy to make that available to everyone, whether people would actually read it. People would be getting their version of it from Fox News or Rachel Maddow, and so they'd think different things about the same document. But if everybody read it and then everybody expressed an opinion, I think most historians are comfortable with the idea that it would have split the country roughly down the middle, but we don't know for sure. I actually think from what I've seen that maybe it would have been the Anti-Federalists would have had a slight majority, but that's just really speculative. We just don't know for sure.
Hello. I have 23 questions. I'm kidding. 2 questions. First one, it's you said that you have to give in regards to the title because of the marketing thing. Is there anything that you have given in that you can share with us? We do not have media here. The first question. And
anything else besides the
title? Yeah. And that you can share. And the second one is related to the framers. I haven't seen the book yet, but have you thought of going in even in the characters of the framers, especially in their beliefs in regards to their Christianity? Thank you.
Right. I only gave in on the title because I didn't have a problem with the title that they wanted, and they were treating the book as a trade book, which means they're going to promote it, not just as an academic book, and I thought if they're going to do that, they're entitled to have a say on the title. Editors don't do much anymore. You read these books from Oxford University Press 30 or 40 years ago, and you get people thanking Sheldon Hackney, who was this celebrated, famous editor who actually edited their books. They just don't do that anymore. I hired my own editor. They have somebody who copy edits, but that's just to align with styles. So my view is the book has to be exactly the way I want it when I send it to them, because they're actually not going to do very much. So Mindy illustrated it. Mindy, my assistant, went and got the pictures. I wrote much of the book description, which is embarrassing because the book description is just talking about how this is the one and only comprehensive history of the founding. But when they write it, you don't like it, so you have to rewrite it. But then it's embarrassing because you have to say those sort of things. My view is everything I can possibly control, I want to, because they're just not as invested in the book as I am. So I didn't give in on anything else. I put in as many pictures as I wanted. It's nice to write books about olden times because there are no copyrights anymore. So it costs a fortune to illustrate a book that's my Jim Crow Civil Rights book. I was paying $300 or $400 a picture, but for this it's almost nothing. Religion's interesting. So there are people who oppose the Constitution on religious grounds. If you think about, for example, Virginia Baptists, they've been persecuted within the recent past by the established Anglican Church, and yet the Constitution has no provision for religious freedom. There is no Bill of Rights. There is no First Amendment. There's no free exercise clause. So Baptists in Virginia, Baptists in Massachusetts overwhelmingly opposed the Constitution, I think because they saw themselves as dissident sects that had been exposed to discrimination, and the Constitution was a step backwards for them. Ironically, some of those same people opposed the Constitution because it was too tolerant with regard to federal office holding. This seems weird to us, but the same Baptists in Virginia who thought there ought to be a protection for free exercise were troubled by the absence of bans on office holding for Catholics, Jews, and Muslims. So in many states at the time, you could only hold office if you were willing to affirm that you believed that in the Old and New Testament. Some states had exclusions for Catholics. Some states only allowed Christians to hold office. So some people actually opposed the Constitution because it was too tolerant. And the reason why there are no office-holding qualifications is because a bunch of the framers were actually pretty separationists. So people like James Madison, James Iredell were willing to defend the proposition that if you don't defend Muslims and Jews, tomorrow you won't be defending Baptists and Quakers either. And they also said, you can trust the citizenry. They're not going to elect Catholics and Jews to the presidency. So. Okay, thanks a lot for coming, everybody.